Inside are 4 members of Robert Mugabe's forces. Outside is the Rhodesian army.
Okay, so we're just dragging the group out at the moment. Give us 5 minutes for that, and let's say another 10 to get the 3 captures plus an escort into the LZ, and then you can send the time. It'll take 15 minutes from now.
This film is about people. The sort of people who may become little more than numbers in a casualty list. Indeed, several of those who appear in this film are already statistics. The Rhodesians claim to have the finest army in the world. This was, however, the most unusual counter-terrorist force operating at the time. It was relatively small. At any one time, there were probably no more than 20,000 men in the field, including a minority of full-time professionals. The majority consisted of part-time soldiers and police reservists. In addition, there were black auxiliary forces numbering about 12,000. Faced with between 8,000 and 10,000 terrorists inside the country and a further 15,000 to 20,000 outside, by all the normal military equations of guerrilla-type warfare, the Rhodesian army should have been defeated several years ago. That it remained in control of the situation reflected not only on the army, but also on the competence of their opponents. But bravery and efficiency was not enough. Combined with international sanctions, the war was steadily strangling the Rhodesian economy. And as the war escalated, there was another price. Hundreds dying each week, most of them black civilians and terrorists. All of them Zimbabwe Rhodesians.
Let's go, come on, you people move up on that side. Come on, don't fall out. Get back again, get back.
All white Rhodesian men between 18 and 55 years were conscripted to serve in the forces.
Come on, hurry up.
Two, come on, get on there.
Initially called up for a year and a half, they then served for either 3 or 6 months a year, depending on their age. Until 1978, the Africans were all volunteers, but conscription of blacks began in 1979. Because of sanctions, the Zimbabwe Rhodesian army was very short of modern weapons. It had few helicopters, most of its aircraft were old and outdated, and much of its equipment was locally made. The country had nearly 3,000 kilometers of hostile border. This vast area had to be patrolled by men on foot. Until recently, few Zimbabwe Rhodesians, white or black, had much knowledge of how to live in the African bush. The majority of whites live in the towns, and most blacks come from the relatively densely populated tribal areas. But the war changed many young men from suburbanites and farmers into bushmen.
We're interested in your sport. Make sure that there is some other things which can rub your sport. Give me 4 things which can rub the sport.
Because of rain,
Yeah.
elephants, and human moving around people.
I want good, clear answer with onions and tomatoes.
Animals,
Yeah.
humans,
Yeah.
wind,
Yeah.
rain.
Of course. Super. Okay. I think that is the end of our revision.
Tracking was perhaps the most important skill in the Zimbabwe Rhodesian army. Men from all different units were trained how to do it. Frequently, after an attack on a farm or a road ambush, or simply on patrol, the only way was to find the terrorists in the huge African hinterland, was to pick up their trail and follow it, sometimes for days at a time. This reliance on tracking by an entire army was not just unusual, it was virtually unique. The ability to live off roots, leaves, insects, and wild animals is not much use in day-to-day soldiering. It is easier to open a tin of corned beef.
Yeah. Poison it? Yeah. Bushmen use it for... Tastes sour as well. Tastes sour? You've been eating it? No, I just tasted it.
The training does, however, induce an awareness of the bush and increase powers of observation. In a war in which most of the fighting was done with rifles, at ranges of a few meters, quick observation could mean the difference between life and death.
The high moisture content is not a substitute for water. It makes your water go a little bit further.
Learning how to make a fire was also part of the course. Like a lot of other military training, the real value of all this is psychological, for it gives the soldiers confidence in what to most is a new and hostile environment. "85% of the regular army was black. Most were volunteers, with compulsory service only recently introduced. Many blacks, especially in the towns, said they would refuse the draft. But there were in fact more volunteers than the army could actually handle.
Before you crawl forward, unoita some working parts forward under control. Then unoita completely stripping. Okay. After that, you load again the gun. Load the gun. Matarisa, load the gun. Come on.
Come on, come on, come on, come on!
The war caused wide-scale unemployment throughout the country, and most blacks joined up for economic reasons. Once in the army, there was no going back, for the recruits quickly discovered that it was unsafe to visit their families in the tribal areas. Over 100 black soldiers were killed by terrorists whilst on leave in their villages, and so the army became their new family.
Get up, get up, get up, get up! Hey, Douglas, back again.
This sense of belonging was deliberately fostered in training. Loyalty was developed, not to the government or a political item, but to the army, the regimental flag, the battalion, and ultimately the soldier's own infantry company. Based on the system used in the British Army and the French Foreign Legion, it is one of the most successful methods of military indoctrination ever devised, and it worked as well in Rhodesia as it ever did on the battlefields of Europe. The recruits were mostly farmers' sons. Their basic training lasted 6 months. In that time, they absorbed little more than the rudiments of their new profession. It took a further 2 years under good NCOs and officers before they could be regarded as fully trained. By then, they were the equal of the best infantry soldiers anywhere in the world. This is an anti-ambush exercise. The recruits were being taught to charge straight at the enemy. The real thing was very different. In this incident, 26 soldiers in 2 Rhodesian-made armored trucks were ambushed from a range of about 40 meters.
We were riding along with 15 guys in the first Puma and 11 blokes in the second one, when all of a sudden one of the blokes in the back of the first Puma saw some tours lying in the grass, and we opened up on that, and that detonated a landmine electrically, which went up just in front of the first Puma. So we stopped, and from then they let drip with rockets and small arms fire, and since then we swept the area, finding 1 dead tour and a whole lot of kit. We had 2 blokes injured, 1 bloke badly injured with a round in his head and a round in his body, and the other bloke was shot in the foot.
Good troops would have virtually wiped out this small convoy. But the terrorists set off the mine too early and completely missed both trucks with their anti-tank rockets. The winding dirt roads of Rhodesia are ideal for such attacks. Properly organized, the terrorists could bring traffic in the country areas to a standstill. All armies depend heavily on the local population for food, information, and new recruits. In order to deny them access to the people, the government concentrated almost 500,000 Africans, a tenth of the rural population, into some 200 protected villages. The inhabitants were allowed out at 6 in the morning to work in their fields, but they had to be back by 6 in the evening. If found wandering around after dark in curfew areas, a man was liable to be shot by the army. Over 300 such curfew breakers were killed. These villages, which contain an average of 2,500 people, were mostly administered by young white Rhodesians on call-up. 18 or 19-year-olds, they spent up to a year and a half in one village. To defend a place, they had only 15 to 20 African soldiers. The rural Africans appear to have mixed feelings about life in these camps. Some who supported Mugabe or Nkomo resented them bitterly, while others seemed to like the improvement in sanitation, water supplies, and medical care. To the African nationalist parties in the towns, however, the protected villages were anathema. They had become a symbol of white rule. Black leaders in the transitional government in 1978-79 announced that the camps would be dismantled, but in fact, most of them remained. These soldiers have been called in to investigate what appears to be a terrorist camp.
Okay, right. Bigari, just get around here, facing that way, okay?
They approach with considerable care to find a small collection of makeshift huts hidden in the dense bush. There are no terrorists, just 2 very old men.
Yeah, affirmative. When I say hut, I mean a sort of a V-shaped frame of trees with grass on top, and they're just sleeping places, rather like we'd make if we didn't have tents, copy? Kopachimombe, bring that old man here, please.
About once a month, the terrorists succeed in destroying a protected village. Ordered to leave by the terrorists, the inhabitants often end up in little settlements like this.
Bring him here. What do you think, Kopachimombe? You think this is a tear place or not?
What happened? What he said. They've been living somewhere.
Yeah.
Caught between the government and the terrorists, people who would happily do without either were harassed, uprooted, and sometimes killed.
Yeah, flat. That they couldn't go out. So they hid here. So they are going to wait here until the river is up. Enough so that they can cross. Then they go to Toko barefoot. Okay. 1-9 Alpha 1. Alpha 1, yeah. So this place is definitely not a tour base camp. The modified story is that a group of people took the gap out of a PV and found the river in flood. So they couldn't cross it and they were too frightened to go back to the PV, so they just based up here. Can you just tell this man, they're asking to get bombed by the Air Force and shot by the soldiers, okay? So just advise him to get out of these huts as soon as possible with all the people and go back to the PV.
Corporal Chamombe explains the situation to the old man.
Okay, right, guys, let's go back to the LZ.
The same group of soldiers is sent to investigate a village suspected of harboring terrorists. The men instinctively recognize that things are normal. Nevertheless, the villagers are interrogated.
Can you just tell these people that we've searched their huts, but we haven't taken anything, okay? We're going to take this man with us for questioning, but he won't be harmed, all right?
Why don't you go
Okay, guys, let's move it.
The penalty for assisting the terrorists was imprisonment. The penalty for assisting the army was possible death at the hands of the terrorists themselves.
Okay, right. Just tell him we will give him. Okay, guys, it's safe.
In this incident, 17 men, women and children were allegedly killed by two of Nkomo's terrorists. Half the victims were forced into a hut and burned alive. Thousands of black civilians died at the hands of the terrorists during the war. The use of terror tactics is a recognized, if hideous, stage in the development of a guerrilla campaign. In this respect, Zimbabwe Rhodesia was no different from Northern Ireland, Cyprus or Algeria. This is a tea estate on the Mozambique border. About 3 years ago, 27 laborers were killed by a group of Mugabe's terrorists. As a result, 2/3 of the workforce fled. The tea company, faced with economic ruin, recruited a small private army. It hired an ex-army sergeant major and 50 men. The government gave rifles, and the company invested in mine-proofed Land Rovers and kilometers of fencing. Within the year, the workforce was back to its full strength of 2,000, and the company expanded. Although not very impressive as soldiers, these men were enough to deter the terrorists. There were about a dozen attacks on the workers in the fields and in their houses after the guards were recruited, but no one was killed or injured. Such solutions were only possible with companies. For individual farmers, it was very different. Often depicted as living in miniature fortresses, the farmers are in reality very vulnerable. No farmhouse could withstand a determined attack by 30 or 40 well-armed men. The fact that most attacks were repelled by one man with a rifle or women and children armed with little more than shotguns and pistols was a measure of the terrorists' lack of ability. The 5,500 white farmers employ 40% of the country's workforce and earn nearly 50% of Rhodesia's foreign exchange. Production almost trebled in the 13 years after UDI, and Rhodesia became completely self-sufficient agriculturally. But in the past year, production was being badly affected by the war. These farms are amongst the most efficient in Africa and were an obvious target for the terrorists. Well over 100 farmers, or their wives and children, have died in the war, mostly in ambushes or on landmines. For the urban population, white or black, terrorism, and indeed the war, caused relatively little disruption.
Ollie, stand back, sweetheart. You fill in there, yeah? Yeah.
But for the farmers and their African labor, terrorism meant fear. Fear in the daytime on narrow dirt roads. Fear at night when the dogs barked.
Hey, don't flunk me.
Fear especially when the husband was doing army service and the wives had to run the farm.
Nu niet goed, je bent niet number 6 in de panelap, eh? Hoe mis je
Fear, worst of all, for small children. All farmers had to do between 3 and 6 months military service a year. Most did willingly, for, more so than anyone else, they were defending their property and their families from attack. These men belonged to the police reserve. Friends organized themselves into patrols of 5 or 6 men, elected their own leaders, and often operated within sight of their own farms. The leader of the patrol coming in briefs those going out. Each patrol stayed out for 5 or 6 days at a time, came in for 24 hours rest, and went out again. With a reputation for courage and determination, they were even nicknamed by the terrorists, who called them the old men who shoot straight.
George wanted to cut this bloody woman.
Many of these men were born on their farms or hacked them out of virgin land. A large number say they will leave feet first, or not at all. Some quite clearly mean it.
You ask all these piccaninnies. Now, at my foot is kraal, there's a small little piccaninny there, young pickers. And you give him a couple of sweets, and this bloke will tell you all the information you want to know right till this morning.
Although they constitute only 10% of Rhodesia's white population, the attitude of these men and their families is crucial to the survival of the country.
Foxtrot Alpha, Foxtrot Whiskey. Roger will pick up. Are you ready to copy riddle of pickup point? Copy. Roger that. We will be there at approximately 1300 hours.
If the farms hold out in the changing situation, then probably most of the urban whites will stay. But if these men lose faith in the future and start to abandon their farms in large numbers, then white morale could collapse throughout the country, and the great exodus will have begun.
It's no good to us, Bobby, for us to be down there. We've got to be under Bobby's control. It'll be better, because if we go down there, we're no good to you. Too far away. Just have a chin. All right, Don is doing that. Just look.
During the following fortnight of the men in this patrol, one survived an attack by 40 terrorists on his house at night, and another lost half his crop of tobacco in a fire started by terrorists. The patrol commander had his glasses smashed by a bullet in a skirmish, and of 2 African trackers with the patrol at the time, one was badly wounded and the other killed. Whatever the dangers to the white farmers, they at least had guns and some freedom of choice. The rural Africans had neither. The terrorists found it comparatively difficult to kill a farmer. It was easier to destroy him by frightening away his labor. But many farm workers were reluctant to leave their homes and jobs, and were sometimes only persuaded by murder.
The war in Rhodesia continues. And these sad duties become more and more common. Our colleague Kunatsa was not fighting for the continuation of one race in power.
Kurwa kwakuchita kunatsa anga asingarwipo kuti arwe achibatsira kuti rumwe rudzi rurambe rwuri muchinzvimbo chokutonga.
He was fighting in order that his children should lead a better life during their lifetimes.
Kurwa kwaanga achiita kwanga kuripo kuti vana vake nemhuri yake nehama dzake vave vane kugara kwakanaka.
Whether or not these sentiments were entirely believed by the audience, it has finally been borne in on the whites that the days of their rule are over. Most rural Rhodesians, white and black, now long for peace. They can only hope that they will now get it.
Oyo tava kupa mochetsitsi. Iwi uri rumuku rumbenyu. Ugeri uchitonga na baba no mweyo nyera. Mwari mumwi narini narini. Amen.
These boats are patrolling the northern border with Zambia along Lake Kariba. Like much of the Zimbabwe-Rhodesian war effort, these operations were hampered by lack of money. There were too few boats and not enough men. There were perhaps 10,000 terrorists on the other side of this strip of water. It would require dozens of boats, hundreds of kilometers of wire, and thousands of mines to seal this one border. Zimbabwe Rhodesia had neither the men nor the money for the job.